This unit is about imperialism. Let's start this unit by looking at this cartoon. Um, what do you think the snake represents? We see it has a crown. It kind of looks like one of the kings of Europe or a European monarch. And it's coiling around an African to show Europe's abuse or colonization of the African continent. It's called In the Rubber Coils of the Congo Free State. It's a 1906 British cartoon criticizing the abuses of Leopold II's rule of the Congo Free State. Leopold II was one of the most cruel colonists. He just absolutely treated the people terribly, murdered many of them, abused them. By selling off large tracts of the Congo to the highest bidder, Leopold opened the door to a rapacious exploitation of people and resources by short term business profiteers. Reports of atrocities reaching Europe sparked reactions, as shown here, contributing to the decision by the Belgian government to take over formal administration of the Congo in 1908. Imperialism. Well, imperialism is very similar to colonialism, with one major difference. Colonial powers settle the countries of which they gain control, while imperial powers do not. The term imperialism does not seem to exist before the 1800s. 19th century imperialism was spurred in large part by the Industrial Revolution. The development of new industrial economies in the 1700s and 1800s necessitated the acquisition of raw materials and the desire to gain control of marketplaces. Thus, by the mid 1800s, imperialistic actions of strong nations, most notably European nations, but also Asian ones, started to become policy. So on our slide, we have imperialism, the policy by a stronger nation to attempt to create an empire by dominating weaker nations economically, politically, culturally, and militarily. So, how did imperialism begin? What brought about imperialism during this particular time period? Let's dive into that. While the Industrial Revolution had a large part to play, throughout most of the 19th century, Great Britain experienced unprecedented power resulting from its position in the world's as the world's first industrialized nation. It also soon became the world's wealthiest nation. Britain earned the nickname the workshop of the world due to its ability to manufacture finished products quickly, efficiently, and cheaply. By the middle of the 19th century, industrialization had spread across Europe and the United States, aided by the development of railroad links that brought resources to new factories and transported their finished goods to world markets. Economic motives provided perhaps the strongest impetus for imperialism. Nations strove to control weaker nations because they hoped to expand their own economies, acquire raw materials, possibly obtain new sources of labor, and or gain new marketplaces for their products. Africa became one of the main sources of raw materials for industrializing nations. So we see here greed. They want to get rich. They want to make more money by making more things. So with industrialization, they need more materials, which will lead for them to try to conquer more areas for those materials. So the economy and industrialization, huge factors of imperialism. Technology. Developments in technology influenced colonial expansion and exploration as well. The steam engine revolutionized transportation, powering both seagoing vessels and land vehicles such as trains. Advances in transportation and communication allowed for increased exploration of more remote regions of the world. Other innovations, such as the telegraph, provided vast improvements in long distance communication. So, how could this affect Africa? Inner Africa had escaped becoming Islamic due to the Sahara Desert keeping armies out. But with the new technologies, you could take a steamship or a train and go right through the desert quickly, or off the coast into the interior of Africa for the first time and conquer it. So technology aided in imperialism that way. It made it easier to conquer, harder to reach places. The Maxim Gun. Changes in weaponry gave European countries an advantage over native populations. In 1885, the Maxim Gun was invented. It could fire 500 rounds a minute. The British Army began using the gun in 1889. And yes, they did use it to conquer more colonies. Exploration. British missionary and explorer David Livingstone was one of the first Europeans to travel across the continent of Africa. His explorations paved the way for Europeans to chart the interior of the dark continent. By the second half of the 1800s, Europeans had a good idea of the vast natural resources that Africa harbored. So it's hard to conquer something you don't know anything about. Exploration aided imperialism by letting people know where the goods were that they wanted so badly. Ideological motivations. All European nations who participated in imperialistic activities during this time period supported missionary activities in one way or another, spreading the Christian faith. In addition, a belief in the superiority of the white race produced the idea that whites had a responsibility to civilize non-whites. Although the term survival of the fittest was first used by Herbert Spencer in 1851, it gained greater fame when Charles Darwin used it in his discussion of natural selection in the Origin of Species book. The late 19th century saw the rise of a philosophy known as social Darwinism, which, among other things, used the principle of natural selection, survival of the fittest, to explain the need for stronger countries to dominate weaker ones. They saw it as natural that a strong country would conquer a weaker country. Ideological motives both rationalized and provided a measure of justification for European imperialism. So they had it in their heads that it's okay to do this. Here's a famous poem that kind of sums up this imperialism based on racism. In this poem, British author Rudyard Kipling urges civilized nations to extend their control over those who were half-devil and half-child. The White Man's Burden was first published in McClure's magazine and has generated a tremendous response. Many authors wrote poems of their own mimicking the White Man's Burden poem and attacking Kipling's idea. So, let's read it. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go blind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half-deviled and half-child. Take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror and check the show of pride, by open speech and simple, 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. The advertisement in this slide shows U.S. Admiral George Dewey washing his hands with Pear's soap, while surrounded by illustrations symbolizing progress and civilization. It was published on the inside front cover of the October 1899 issue of McClure's magazine. The political landscape of the European continent had undergone some significant changes by the last half of the 19th century. In some countries, monarchies had either fallen or ceded much of their power to the military and or legislative bodies. Allegiance to a king or queen ceased to be the most important factor in binding the people of a country together. Instead, the main unifying force became the idea that the people of each nation possessed a unique character that should not only be celebrated within the nation, but recognized and respected by other nations as well. This is nationalism. Thinking, oh, we're better. In addition, the French Revolution had opened a Pandora's box and given common people throughout Europe notions of someday gaining political say in the running of their countries. In the French Revolution, the people overthrew the king and this inspired a lot of other countries to do likewise. The 1830s and 1840s witnessed a growing discontent that culminated in revolutions in several European countries in 1848. Later, two major unification movements occurred, creating nations of Germany and Italy out of what had been loose agglomerations of semi independent states. New wellsprings of national pride sprang up as a result, and lower classes became aware of their political might. In addition, technological innovations of the Industrial Revolution had led to major improvements in weaponry, and many were itching to flex its new military muscle. Imperialism provided an outlet for both nationalism and militarism. If a nation could increase its imperial possessions, it would elevate the standing of all its citizens among the peoples of Europe. New military might could be used not only to subdue indigenous peoples and gain control of their land, but also to keep other European nations from gaining control of those lands. After Prussia's victory over France in the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, Prussian leader Otto Bismarck was finally able to create a unified German state. Under Bismarck's leadership, Germany began an intensive policy of industrialization. These are your discussion questions for today on the first video of imperialism.